Hello and salam. My name is Mehran Hegirian and I'm the Director of Regional Initiatives at the Bourse and Bazaar Foundation. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this panel on sanctions, employment, and labor in Iran. This panel was organized by Bourse and Bazaar Foundation visiting fellow Zep Kalp, and the panel will be moderated by board member Dr. Javad Salehi-Isfahani. I will pass it to Javad to start the session, but please bear in mind, you can pose your questions in the Q&A box throughout the session, but perhaps after each panelist. We will gather them all and respond during the Q&A session at the end. Thank you. Javad, please.
Hello and welcome to everyone. I'm very pleased. My name is Javad Salehi-Isfahani. I'm a professor of economics at Virginia Tech. I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel. It's an excellent panel. Today, I am happy for two reasons. One, that this is about Iran, and it's about Iran's economy, and it's not about inflation. It's about employment. That's really important to emphasize. The second one is that it has a panel of real experts. We have Dr. Pouya Alidadi from Tehran University. It's a treat to have someone who lives in Iran and does his research in Iran to speak about employment conditions now. Then we have the famed sociologist, feminist author, Valentine Moghadam, is a professor of sociology and international affairs at Northeastern University. An old friend. And then we have someone who will be famous soon, Zep Kalp, who knows Iran very well. And he's also a sociologist, although since he works with Professor Kevin Harris, he probably knows a lot about Iran's economy as well. So this promises to be a very interesting and a stimulating panel. We're going to go with the three papers first, hopefully not taking more than 30-35 minutes, to leave us 20 minutes at least for the Q&A, which will come at the end. And the order of the presentations will be the way the announcement was made, and it's also alphabetical. Dr. Alaedini will go first, then Zep, and then Dr. Moghadam. So I'm not going to discuss the panels, discuss the papers. There's not enough time to do a full discussion. I will perhaps make some comments at the end of each paper, and then maybe at the end, like everybody else, I will raise my hand. If you do have a question, please put it on the Q&A, and we will monitor that, and we'll try to raise those questions with the authors. You can address them to specific authors, if you like, or to all the authors. So without further ado, let's give the floor to Dr. Pouya Alidadi, who will be talking about, forget the title of his paper, I'm sorry. I will look it up in 1 second.
I will put it up in a second.
Employment and labor challenges in Iran.
I modified it a little bit. I'm not going to talk so much about the labor challenges, but more about employment. And I would like to thank the organizers of this event, and also Professor Salehi-Isfahani for moderating the session. So I'll be talking about employment, major issues related to employment challenges in Iran. Actually, these challenges go back, can be traced back to the period prior to the revolution, when the oil-based and capital-intensive development, together with the migration of unskilled labor into the larger cities, created high rates of unemployment and underemployment, which probably acted as a factor in the revolutionary events of 1978-79. Given those circumstances, Iran's Islamic Republic Constitution is very specific about the role of the government to provide jobs for everybody. But in the past 40 years, high rates of population growth and have basically created a huge need, continuous need for significant employment generation. And Iran has had 6 national development plans so far, and something else I should add, the vision document. All of these have envisaged rapid growth rates, usually about 8%, to create adequate and good jobs. The 6th development plan, which was initiated 5 years ago and it's ending now, calls for the reduction of unemployment rate to 8.6% by 2021 through rapid, sustainable employment generating growth. And this would have required 8% GDP growth and generation of 975,000 jobs per year, which has remained elusive due to the economic circumstances. If we look at the longer term trend, the unemployment rate has been usually above 10%, sometimes just falling slightly below 10% and going up to 15%, 16%. GDP per capita has not grown, and in fact is less than it was 50 years ago. And it's now less than it was 50 years ago. And throughout this period, we've also experienced high rates of inflation. Obviously, these things are reflective of development policy shortcomings and major issues. This figure from a recent World Bank report shows the growth record over the past 5 years. Right after the adoption of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, there was a sudden growth due to the surge in the oil exports in 2016, 2017. But then after that, due to the withdrawal of the United States under the Trump administration from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, we see a drop in oil exports, and as a result, negative growth rates. That caused a little bit in 2020, 2021, caused the manufacturing agriculture to actually grow, probably because of there was also huge currency depreciation. But after that, then there has been some recovery since then. For example, 4% growth, but that has also been due to the oil sector and the service sector, which is also probably induced by the oil sector, whereas the industrial sector has grown negatively. These are the key labor market indicators of Iran. I don't want to go through all of it, but the main point is that the labor force employed population, the unemployment rate has actually declined in the past couple of years. But we shouldn't be very happy about that because the labor force participation rate has also decreased. In fact, the active population has decreased significantly over the years. So notwithstanding the effects of the sanctions, the COVID pandemic, starting in March 2020, reduced the active population by approximately 1.5 million persons, the employed population by around 1 million persons, including 250,000 in agriculture, 743,000 in service, and 17,000 in the industrial sector. Also, the participation rate was reduced from 44% to 41%. Obviously, there are significant variations across the provinces and between urban and rural areas. This table provides some information about female unemployment and labor force participation rates. Again, female unemployment rate appears to be dropping, but that's again due to reduced female labor force participation rate. And overall, the rate of female labor force is extremely low in Iran, and the unemployment is very high. So despite the high educational achievements of Iranian women, their employment and labor force participation rates remain small. This means loss of GDP, potential productivity gains, potential poverty alleviation. This sometimes is attributed to the oil-enhanced patriarchal structure and the government's reluctance because it fears that if it brings more women into the labor market, the unemployment rate would increase and it favors men over women. We should be a little bit, more careful and look into the details of these things. For example, job opportunities for women in low-income households are very different from those for wealthy households. For example, in a lot of wealthy families, essentially, it doesn't make much sense for many women, or they think they don't find it attractive to work because how much money do they make? Very little. So why would you bother? So that kind of a patriarchal structure is reinforced there. For women in the low-income families, there is no, where do they go? Whereas wealthy families are highly educated, all of that. Low-income families are often not. These are unemployment and participation rates for various age groups. I've colored some of the important numbers in red, and these are numbers that are associated with those that are considered youth between the ages of 15 and 24, or between the ages of 18 and 35. And the second row gives the female unemployment rate, which is very high in this age group. Also, another two rows in the middle are for those in the age group 15 to 24. That's also, again, very high and very high, extremely high for females. Part of the reason for the fact that labor force participation rates are so low for young people in Iran is that there expansion of educational opportunities. This obviously is a positive development on the surface, but it has a negative aspect. One is the sudden expansion of tertiary level has caused the quality to drop. Another one is it has only delayed the entry of the labor of young people into the labor market, and a host of other issues. There was never any connection between the education system and the needs of the Iranian economy, or the future needs of the Iranian economy. So that this means there's a lot of mismatch, skills mismatch. Again, I've turned a few of these things in red, but if you look at these numbers, in fact, they show some positive signs, which require actually closer scrutiny, I would say. The unemployment rate for college university graduates has actually declined. Their participation rate actually has increased. This is different from the previous tables that I showed. So what does that mean? Is the Iranian economy now creating jobs for the educated people? Or maybe it's that the educated people, and including educated women, which have suddenly increased their participation in the labor force, have no choice but to enter the labor market because of the economic situation, and they're willing to do any job. Well, I don't know.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you wrap it up in 2 minutes, please?
In 2 minutes. Oh, I thought I had 15 minutes. Sorry, I prepared for 15 minutes. Okay. So part of, can I have 3 minutes to show 3 slides with your permission? Rigid labor, that also requires closer scrutiny because wage determination is basically government control, and also you see that there is a need for better social dialogue given the recent labor protests. Since poor people are in fact working, the main demands are pay increases in accordance with the provisions of the High Council of Labor, receiving delayed wages and unpaid insurance contributions, job security, and ending attacks on the labor organization. So I'll just show one more slide. Then You know, there is I would say to actually address, you can address the rigidity of the labor market. You can improve the active labor market policies, which I didn't get a chance to actually talk about. And you can improve social dialogue. But this will still not create adequate employment because of a major issue, structural issue in the Iranian economy. Essentially, there are three, I would say, I have counted three major circuits of accumulation in the Iranian economy. One is oil exports, government, import, and distribution. The second one is real estate finance and various speculative activities. And third major circuit is resource-based and energy-intensive exports. These have several important intersections. This is my last slide. This is a slide about real estate prices, comparing consumer price index and land price index. The land price index is the top curve, and it's so the prices have grown much faster than the rate of inflation. Obviously, whoever has access to land makes a lot of money, and the amount of money that person makes dwarfs any salaries that, for example, a professor can make in a year. So if there is, I have some more slides, but if there is a chance, I can show them later. Thank you very much. Okay.
Could you please unmute?
Thank you, Professor Alaedini. Let me take it over from here.
Sorry,
I hope everyone
can
see. Oh, excuse me, I'm pressing the wrong buttons.
So can I just make a couple of comments? First of all, as I said at the beginning, I will not make extensive comments, but I do wanted to make one point, an exception that those of you who are familiar with my work know I'm very sensitive to this measurement of the GDP per capita. And you should know that the statistics that the World Bank reports from the Central Bank of Iran have major flaws in terms of measuring living standards before and after the revolution. And there's no such thing as living standards are 20, 30% below before the revolution. You know, just think about, can you find any historical example of a country where infant mortality, maternal mortality has fallen, education has increased, access to basic services like electricity, natural gas, roads, appliances, washing machines have improved, and living standards have collapsed by 30%. There is none. So there's something wrong with the GDP data. If you want to get better measurements, you should use PPP, purchasing power parity data that the World Bank publishes, and also Penroll tables. With that, I'll leave my other remarks to the end of the panels. I thought the presentation was comprehensive. Dr. Alaedini raised very important issues, including the issue of gender that we will hear more about from Dr. Moghadam. But for the moment, we will go to keep the order as announced to Zep Kalp, who will be talking about sanctions, employment, and occupation class in Iran, 2010 to 2020. 10 to 12 minutes. Thank you.
I'll do my best, Javad. Thank you very much. Let me quickly share my screen so that you can also see my presentation. So, hello everyone, my name is Zep Kalp. I'm a current PhD student in sociology at UCLA. I'm also a visiting fellow currently at the Bourse and Bazaar Foundation. So very quickly, before I start my presentation, I would like to thank the Bourse and Bazaar Foundation for offering me this opportunity, and especially also Mehran and Yar for all of their tremendous work and effort in especially running the show at the Bourse and Bazaar Foundation. So the presentation I'll be talking about today is actually a report that I'm writing for the foundation about looking at more at occupational class and employment in the sanctions period, the 2010s. So any comments, questions, or suggestions are really greatly appreciated. You can send them in the comment box here, or feel free to send me an email too if you have any comments on the content of my presentation, which is still a rough draft version. So as Dr. Alaedini has mentioned, to put this slightly more in comparative perspective, Iran has gone through a severe economic recession over the past 10 years, and this is not entirely unique. The entire MENA region has experienced stagnation. It's essentially been quite a lost decade, but as you can see, sanctions have really reduced Iran's comparative standing in the regional, in the wider region. So every time sanctions were imposed in 2010, 11, and again in 2017, 18, you see that the Iranian economy nosedives here as measured in international dollars. And so sanctions have played a real role in reducing incomes in Iran. But I don't think we should forget this broader regional picture of stagnation across the region. However, if we look at unemployment rates, and economists that look at this, Professor Alaedini and Javad have also talked about this, you actually see a more mixed picture. So unlike what we would have expected, where sanctions increase unemployment rates, actually in Iran we see that sanctions, especially in the early 2010s, reduced unemployment rates. This partially has to do with lower labor costs and some of the government policies that were adopted in the wake of sanctions. But so even at the regional level, Iran has actually not done that poorly in terms of unemployment. And actually a similar picture, comparatively similar picture, is established if you look at labor force participation rates. These are modeled ILO estimates, and so these are some of the best available data out there. Also, what I'll be doing today is I'm going to be talking a little bit more about occupational classes and employment. I think this is interesting from perhaps a more sociological point of view. There's already been quite a lot of research looking at a changing income, declining household incomes, rising poverty rates in Iran. And often social classes in Iran are defined by looking at different income quintiles, but much less research has really looked at occupational class in Iran. And I think that this can give us a broader understanding of what social class in Iran means. Of course, in Iran as well as elsewhere, incomes are still mostly defined by occupation. And so this can, I think, also give us a perspective on why some of the socioeconomic protests have been happening in Iran over the past years, why some groups of people are protesting and others haven't been protesting as much. So research questions that I'm addressing is, how has the quality of work changed over the course of the 2010s? Really, analysts would expect that these sanctions and the severe economic recession have produced, higher degrees of job instability, higher rates of precarity, a growing informal sector. But is that really the case? And if so, to what extent? Have these major economic readjustments led to a changing composition of the occupational class structure in Iran? And then lastly, I know this is a very short talk, but I'll do my best to also talk a little bit about which occupational classes have suffered relatively more. In other words, is there a change in the relative standing of occupational classes vis-a-vis each other? Briefly, I used the household expenditure and income surveys, which is the best available data to really look at this. Unfortunately, it also has some limitations. And the main limitation of it, obviously, is that it's an income survey. So all of these work characteristics and employment relations are a secondary interest of the survey. And so you have to be a bit creative, and you have to really look at the margins of the survey in order to get some of that data. So I'll be defining here occupational class by, and this is important to remember, I'll be defining it by the main job of the highest earning household member of each household. And so a household is given a certain occupational class, all right? So say if I'm an accountant, my main job is accountancy, and I'm the highest earning household member, say I'm the household head, then the occupational class that I'm ascribed to is, a professional class. So this is all going to make more sense as I'm explaining this in the discussion. So looking here just broadly at the class composition at very aggregate level over the past 10 years, as you can see, I've used several aggregate occupational classes: professional managerial class, small proprietors, people who own small businesses, non-agricultural classes, or say the urban working classes, agricultural classes, so people who work on the land, working classes who don't own land, who work on the land, and farmers. You see that the class composition actually hasn't changed that much at all, even though there have been very severe economic readjustments over this period. And this also holds if we disaggregate the class composition a little bit more into slightly more micro classes. We also see a picture of relative stability over time. So that's quite interesting. Looking at informality, and this is a difficult concept, but it's often measured by looking at social insurance coverage and pension coverage. Looking at that across these occupational classes, again, we don't really see that informality has increased over the past 10 to 13 years. In fact, for some classes, it appears to have actually been falling, especially small proprietors and urban working class, non-agricultural laborers. They've actually become more formal over the past 10 years. Similarly, if we look at job stability and precarity, again, the survey is not perfect to measure that, but all of these indicators, work hours per week, the percentage of household heads that are working part-time, the percentage of household heads that are quitting their job over the past years, all of these measures remain relatively constant. So there appears by these metrics, there appears to be relatively little change. Informality even appears to be declining. Explanations addressing this, might say the reason for that is that the Iranian workforce was already highly precarious and relatively flexible even before the imposition of sanctions. So for the various groups that actually became more precarious, these are relatively small groups that we don't see that at the national level. And in terms of class composition, this is a more difficult question to address. Now, let's look at the second part. I don't have a lot of time, but very quickly, let's look at the second part, the last part of the question that I asked, which was looking at the relative changes in the standing of occupational classes vis-a-vis each other. So what I did here is I graphed the mean annual changes in real household spending by these various occupational classes. And just for the sake of my presentation here, I included the public sector separately along these occupational classes, because I think the public sector in Iran is actually quite interesting. They're mostly government employees. There's also a small contingent of industrial workers. And so what do we see by looking at this from 2010 to 2019? We see that, first of all agricultural classes, so both farmers who own land and agricultural workers who don't own land, they work on the land, have seen a real tremendous fall in their household spending over the course of this period. They've been the hardest victims of the 2010s. By contrast, on the other side of the graph, you see these non-agricultural private sector laborers, in other words, the urban working class that work in the private sector. They've actually done relatively well. They've still experienced a decline in their household spending, but they did so, they fared relatively well compared to these other occupational classes. Here, looking at these middle classes, sort of the middle class in Iran, professional managerial classes, small proprietors, and the public sector, they've also had a middle experience, performing in between these agricultural classes and these non-agricultural working classes. So finally, I divided this up into two periods. One is the 2013 to 2017 period, when there was a relative economic recovery in the Hassan Rouhani's first administration, and then as well as the sanctions period. So let's first look at the 2013 to 2017 period. What do we see here? We see that, again, farmers did relatively poorly, as did agricultural laborers. In other words, the explanation for why they fared so bad over the course of the 2010s might not be entirely related to sanctions. Whereas the public sector, in this small period of time, did actually really well. And their real household spending increased by about 5% every year. And part is related to the fact that their incomes declined by a lot when the first round of sanctions were imposed. But another reason is that the Hassan Rouhani administration really did its best to increase public sector salaries, in part because there were a number of interest organizations that represented public sector workers in the Hassan Rouhani administration that had a relative degree of power. So looking at these—
Couple of minutes, stop. Can you wrap it up, please?
Yep. So finally, looking at these two sanctions periods, we see again that farmers did really poorly, and that looking at these middle classes, the public sector did relatively worse. So the argument that government employees have not been a victim of sanctions is wrong. They've actually been quite a direct victim, and it's clear that the Iranian government has not shied away from imposing austerity measures on the public sector. Again, the working class, interestingly, is entirely split, finding itself on both sides of this graph. And agricultural laborers have done the worst during sanctions, whereas non-agricultural laborers have actually done relatively well. And this is, I think, quite interesting. So, yeah, the discussion here is just a repetition of what I've said. I hope you all remembered it. Let's talk more about this in the Q&A session later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zep. That was fascinating. It's the first time I hear some detailed information coming out of these household surveys. Wonderful job. And some very surprising stuff. I think I learned a lot about the heterogeneity of experience under sanctions. I was surprised to see declining informality. I thought informality might have gone up as a result. It's very good, interesting finding. Farmers not doing well. How much of that is it because of the drought that has also engulfed Iran in the last 10 years? And how much of that is because of sanctions? In some sense, sanctions may have helped because when you don't have oil income, you can't import as much food. You have to turn to your local farmers. And so farmers should be a beneficiary of this change in relative prices, but perhaps they haven't been. So we look forward to hearing more from you either after this or in future writing about the causes of these things. I also like the heterogeneity that you showed for specific groups during different periods of sanctions. Sanctions under Rouhani apparently is very different than sanctions under Ahmadinejad in terms of the incomes of urban groups in particular. So now we turn to Dr. Moghadam, who will be speaking about the international system, labor and gender inequality, comparing Iran and Tunisia. 10 to 12 minutes, Val, please.
I will do my best. And first, I'd like to say how pleased I am to be part of this very, very interesting session and important and valuable insights. And also, I want to apologize to everyone in advance in case I lapse into a coughing fit. It's my allergies, and the pollen count in London is just dreadful. Okay, so I am talking about the international system, women's employment in particular, and gender inequality. I want to focus on Iran, but with a comparative glance with Tunisia, just to make the point about the salience of international factors when it comes to gender inequality and women's employment in the Middle East and North Africa region. So my summary arguments and conceptual frameworks, I argue that economic sanctions, which are intended to change the behavior of the target state, do not accomplish that goal, but they do have distinct gender dynamics that punish women, female citizens in specific ways. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing more from Zep Kalp and Pouya Alidadi in the future about precisely how women in those different economic, occupational categorized households or social classes have been affected by sanctions.
Sorry, Val, if you put your slides in full screen, we see the text better.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was. Okay, what have I thought the text is there. On my screen, it's there. It's not working for you? You don't see the text? Oh dear. Should I just carry on or?
Yeah, carry on.
Okay, all right. Sanctions, I am arguing in today and elsewhere too, are part of what feminist international relations scholars call the continuum of violence, which is a special term that Cynthia Coburn and others have come up with. So it's not just domestic violence or war and such, but it's really a continuum from everything that happens within the household to wars, but including sexual harassment, sanctions, and so on and so forth. So what I would like to argue is that the persistently low female labor force participation in Iran, but also elsewhere in the Middle East, North Africa region, and the continued gender gaps that we see in the region, all of these certainly result from domestic institutions, whether we're talking about formal institutions, laws, policies, etc., or informal patriarchal norms, social norms, etc. But also they derive from external drivers and agents. And here I want to underscore the salience of the international political economy and the so-called world polity. So the conceptual perspectives that I draw on are feminist international relations and feminist political economy, also world polity theory, sometimes also known as world society theory, and world systems analysis about the inequalities across the economic zones of the world system, the role of the hegemon, crisis, and so on. Let me say a little bit also about what we know about female labor force participation in Iran, but also in the region. And Pouya made some references to it. There's been a lot of research on rentier states, the political economy of oil, family law, conservative social norms, employer preferences. And certainly I've contributed to that literature as well. And in a recent chapter in a book on the political economy of the Middle East and North Africa, Professor Masoud Parshanas and I have a review essay in which we are looking at the different types of explanations for low female labor force participation in the region as a whole. And we have categorized them as culturalist arguments, as economic arguments, and as institutionalist arguments. There's another literature too on gender regimes that I also have contributed to, which points out that gender regimes in particular parts of the world are constituted by these four institutional domains: the polity, economy, civil society, and family. In other words, there's been this evolution across time and space from private patriarchy, the private patriarchy of the family, to public patriarchy, where the state and other institutions play a very important role. But then depending on the kind of economy and the kind of civil society and the kind of economy and polity, you might have a neoliberal type of gender regime, for example, in the United States. You might have a social democratic type of gender regime, for example, in the Nordic countries, France, or you might have conservative corporate types of gender regimes, let's say Japan, South Korea, or what I have called neo-patriarchal for most of the Middle East and North Africa. So, all of these arguments and conceptual frameworks draw attention to domestic drivers and agents of both stability and change and progress and regression. And, with respect to gender inequality broadly and women's economic participation more specifically, those three sets of arguments that Parshanas and I discuss in our article focus on the domestic factors and forces that maintain male privilege as well as stratified and segmented labor markets. In the Islamic Republic of Iran, for example, and I think we all know this hybrid but highly masculinist political system, as well as the provisions of the Islamic Constitution, the longstanding reliance on oil revenues and the country's conservative family laws, serve to dampen female labor supply and demand. But what of the role of international factors and forces? How might these affect gender inequality in general, labor markets, and female labor force participation in particular? And what if we moved away from the example just of Iran with its very fraught relations with the US and toward let's look at another country in the region that should have had better outcomes given its political system and its international relations. Tunisia. So the question is, are Tunisian women's labor market difficulties generated only by domestic processes, or does the international political economy and the world polity affect Tunisia's economic, political, and gender equality prospects as well? So let's begin with some stylized depictions of Iran and Tunisia on this table. Can everyone see the table? I hope so. So this is a table, it's a comparative female labor force participation and related indicators for Iran and Tunisia. So on some indicators, you will see there is some convergence. For example, there's low female labor force participation in both countries, although much higher in Tunisia than in Iran. But by the way, in both countries, the highest rates of labor force participation and also the highest rates of unemployment are among university educated women. What is peculiar about those two countries and other countries in the region as well is that lower educated women from lower income families tend to have lower labor force participation rates. And that's something that has exercised a number of us. Also as seen on this, let's see, okay, so we were looking at, let me quickly show this other graph on military spending. What Iran and Tunisia also share are low levels of military spending. In other words, the state seems to prefer to spend, to allocate its budget towards other things. Certainly education in both countries, and also healthcare spending is relatively high in Iran, as some scholars have pointed out. So what you don't see in this, in table 1, this comparative table for Iran and Tunisia, is that Tunisian women have far higher representation in politics and in the parliament than is the case in Iran. And that, of course, has to do with the very different political system and so on. Now, one thing that I want to say about Tunisia, it is true that Tunisia's higher labor force participation, its much higher rate of female political participation, the fact that, for example, a larger proportion of women in Tunisia are receiving unemployment benefits, the fact that a much higher proportion of Tunisian mothers compared to Iranian mothers with newborns are receiving maternity benefits. All of this is a function of Tunisia's state feminism, the legacy of state feminism, starting with Bourguiba, going actually through the authoritarian period also of Ben Ali, and continuing after their 2011 political revolution. But it's also a function of the fact that Tunisia, unlike Iran, has a very strong independent trade union organization, the UGTT, which also has a women's section. However, it's also important to note that Tunisia went through very painful adjustments in the 1990s in line with privatization and flexibilization imperatives, but also because of factory closures as European investors turned from Tunisia, also Morocco, to Eastern Europe once those post-communist Eastern European countries joined the EU. So a lot of female labor force participation, especially among the working class, declined. Okay, so that and
would a couple of minutes be enough to wrap it up, Val?
I think so. Sanctions. Now, moving on to sanctions. What do we know about the sanctions? And I can't say very much about this, but there's a lot of information on this particular slide, and of course on the longer paper that I distributed to the members of the panel. The longest standing sanctions, of course, are against US sanctions, are against Cuba. The next country that has suffered from it is Iran. We also have a lot of information about the societal effects, infrastructural effects, and the gendered effects of the sanctions from the Iraqi experience of the 1990s. There's some information here about Cuba and so on, but I won't get into that right now. So here I put together what we know about the gendered effects of US sanctions in Iran. And this is in part an extrapolation from what we know occurred in Iraq, but also this is the basis of some of the data that we've been learning about. And we heard earlier today, especially with Professor Alaedini, about the declining female labor force participation in Iran. Women have lost out. So in other words, women have always been at a disadvantage in the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's a highly masculinist political system and the economy favors men. But the sanctions have worsened women's economic participation and their economic citizenship, quite frankly. So here I have a listing of the different types of gendered effects. There are employment losses, there are education losses, there are healthcare losses, and we know that the effects of, we know something about the effects of the sanctions on access to medicine, medication, and healthcare in Iran, and the fact that so many healthcare workers lost their lives as well. And the irony of, I don't know if it's ironic or it's tragic, but sanctions have actually reinforced both private and public patriarchy in the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they did the same in Iraq in the 1990s. So controls over female mobility and sexuality are tightened, women's physical insecurity may increase, women's care responsibilities intensify, jobs are prioritized for men. I've got some data here, information on Tunisia's travails, but I think I said something already about it, so let me just go to the conclusions. The point of including this comparison with Tunisia was to point out that Iran is not exceptional. In some ways, it is unique in that it is the target of very punitive US sanctions. It is also in some ways unique because of the kind of political system that it has. But it is not unique in some other ways. It is not unique in that highly educated women try to attain jobs and don't get enough of them, and therefore they declare themselves as unemployed. We see the same thing happening in Tunisia. We see the same thing happening in some other Middle Eastern countries too. And I think my broad argument here is that both Iran and Tunisia, even with very different political systems, very different types of economic arrangements, very different civil societies, they are subject to the capitalist world systemic processes and the fact that they are countries that are at the interstices of periphery and semi-periphery, and therefore at a disadvantage when it comes to actions by much more powerful states and international organizations. So low levels of female labor force participation certainly reflect domestic factors and forces, but also international factors and forces. And this has played out in both Iran and in Tunisia. But ironically, low female labor force participation prevents the emergence of more diverse, productive, and competitive economies that can better withstand external pressures. So if Jamhuriya Islami can come to its senses, if the political elites in Iran can come to their senses and recognize that by providing women with more incentives to join the labor force and stay in the labor force, they can actually build stronger economies and can withstand these international pressures more. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much, Val. That was a very interesting talk. I thought the comparison with Tunisia was very informative, and you had some interesting thoughts on sanctions. Look forward to seeing or reading your paper. Maybe there's more data parsing this impact of sanctions on women's employment and participation. You know, it's kind of puzzling because in some sense, if you believe in Michael Ross's hypothesis that it is not Islam, it's not patriarchy, it's oil money that's keeping women away from the labor market because of this unearned income hypothesis, then sanctions is kind of an experiment where oil income kind of disappears. And we see that women are not really joining the labor market. So maybe that mechanism isn't as valid as we thought.
That's right.
And there are lots of other thoughts that very thought-provoking paper. I hope you continue. I think we should regard sanctions as painful and tragic as it is, as a natural experiment that is moving things around and is letting us learn about how Iran's economy is functioning. With that, I'd like to open the panel to the audience. I have some questions here that I will try to read and ask you. I guess you can also see the questions yourself in the Q&A. There's a question for Zep from Dori Davari. How can increase in the household spending be a determinant of doing better when inflation is quite high and prices are increasing dramatically? Zep.
Thank you for that question. So, I think it's important to separate out inflation from household spending. Often inflation can be quite high, and we're now experiencing this also in Western countries where inflation is going up, but we are not necessarily experiencing economic recession, or household incomes are not necessarily declining. Inflation, of course, also includes labor costs and wages in them. So I would also separately like to add, just because I wasn't able to do so at the end of my presentation, I think one interesting sort of topic to reflect on is how these differences and decline of middle classes in Iran, as I've shown, these public sectors, but also private professional managerial classes, how these have been linked to labor protests. Many of the labor socioeconomic protests in Iran have been staged by middle classes rather than urban working classes, who also have participated occasionally, but many of the more routine protests are staged by government employees, also industrial workers, often at larger companies, some of them still state-owned. So I think I think there's an argument to be made of the relative decline in status of many of these, middle classes, occupational middle classes in Iran over the past 10 years. So this is just a separate point that I still wanted to highlight. I'll just hand it back over to you, Javad.
Thank you, Zep. So Davari has another question, this one for Dr. Alaedini. You mentioned one reason employment rate is increasing is that people have to accept any job to be able to cover their expenses. Is there a gender gap in this regard, considering men are the main breadwinners in Iran?
Thank you for the question. I mentioned the increase in the participation rate of educated people, both males and females. And probably part of the reason for that is that the Iranian society is becoming more educated. So that's why that portion of their participation becomes more pronounced. As for women, there may be the reason maybe that economic hardship is actually forcing more the means for for rentier sort of structures to benefit from rentier structures has diminished. So maybe more women are entering the labor market. The gender gap, for women obviously don't have so many opportunities. Men can work in many, educated men can work in many different occupations, low, high, whatever. But women's opportunities are more limited. So there is certainly a gender gap, but I haven't really studied it.
Thank you very much. We have one other question.
Can I just
Yes.
make one note here?
Yes,
Dr. Alaedini, your own data show and confirm what many of us have been saying, that the highest levels of labor force participation are among college-educated women, and also the highest rate of because unemployment is also part of labor force participation. Whereas, in general, female labor force participation is only something like 13% right now, but for higher, highly educated women, it's 50%. So that's a class gap. There is something going on in those lower income, less educated households that are keeping women from joining the labor force on the supply side, but there's something also happening on the demand side. In other words, there are not the appropriate jobs for them. And if sanctions, as some people have been saying, might actually help manufacturing, Iranian manufacturing, to expand, there has to be some ways to incentivize employers to hire more women and women to join these manufacturing firms.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. A very good point. So the last question that I have here, and I'm going to read, is from Dr. Barkeshli. He asks if we've got any data regarding per capita oil revenues in the economy and how it might have affected the macroeconomic performance. I don't know if anyone here would like to address that. If not, I can say something. Zep, you want to jump in?
I will defer to you, Professor.
Oh, thank you. Well, I know Dr. Barkeshli, and I think he knows more than all of us about this, but nevertheless, let me venture, because I looked at this and I looked at per capita oil revenues in constant dollars, and I found something very, very surprising that I have written about, that today is about a few $100s, maybe between $200 and $300 per person per year. And before the revolution, it was 20 times as high. People often don't recognize that oil revenues were several thousand. We resembled more an oil-rich Gulf nation, Persian Gulf nation, before the revolution. Now we are like Algeria. We have some oil, but really people run their lives based on their labor and skills and physical capital that there is. And by the way, the physical capital is what is often ignored because a lot of it is undervalued. And so, again, the GDP figures that you get from the Central Bank of Iran kind of create a puzzle. Why is it that it appears that in many ways people have more comfortable lives, average person, not everyone, have more comfortable lives than before the revolution, even though the GDP per capita that the government produces is lower now? And the answer is that there's a good infrastructure. There are lots of physical capital in factories, in houses, that's producing value, and they're not valued properly. And I think in terms of oil, people exaggerate the effect of oil as income. Oil is like a lubricant. It allows import of intermediate products that are really critical, like you need a screw to run a whole factory. Oil can be very valuable because it brings you foreign exchange. But in terms of actual income, oil exports are not important. What is important, if it's properly priced, is the domestic consumption of energy, which is 3 times the export of oils these days. You know, if you look at the Iran's energy production, it has basically remained constant before and after the revolution, but the composition has changed drastically. Before, 80% of the energy was exported and we got the money. Now, 80% of the energy is domestically consumed and is kind of hidden because it's supplied essentially for free. But it does generate some value, right? So if these things are priced properly, you will see that the oil revenues that matter are the oil revenues that the government gets from selling oil and gas and electricity to its own population, which is basically a way of taxing the rich because the subsidy goes essentially to rich people, right? 10 times as much of the subsidy goes to the top deciles as to the bottom decile. And if it's evenly, if it's priced competitively, then that subsidy disappears, which is another way of saying you're taxing the rich to pay for the services the poor enjoy. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. If there are no other questions from the audience, I wanted to ask a question from Zep and Dr. Alaedini. You know, I am very interested in learning how flexible is the economy and how well it is responding to this big impact of sanctions, which is to remove the oil revenues. And I've speculated that the local economy will rise up, import substitution. You can't import something, you make it domestically. And I wonder, especially Dr. Alaedini, because you are there and you're looking at employment data. Employment data is telling us something possibly is happening like that, but I don't know if it's happening in terms of production. And Zep has been looking at occupational data, which is a finer grained way of looking at employment. Is something like that do you think something like that is happening? Are some occupations rising because oil income is not allowing imports as much as before? Anyone?
I can. You see a little bit of that. I asked, for example, an industrialist just a couple nights ago whether or not who has a manufacturing operation, and he said that they are in fact they're doing well. They are exporting enough to get enough foreign currency to get their intermediate goods. But their case is maybe unique because they only rely on, let's say, 20% imported content for their production, and that they're doing well because of that. So you see some of that, some import substitution, and even continued export. The one problem with the Iranian economy is the efficiency of the government, the leadership of the government, which is very problematic. During these times, you expect a much stronger leadership and increased efficiency in their activities to manage the situation. But in fact, you see the opposite. And so with that, I'm sure that hurts production because they need their interactions with the government, and they may get disappointed in many of those interactions. So but there is some resilience. There is certainly some resilience, but people are also, everything is relative. If people, when you see your income becoming, the real value of your income becoming smaller, you are not very happy, even if it's 20%. An outsider may say only the 20% of these people's income, it was only increased by 20%, but that's a lot. It's relative what you're losing and what you're gaining in all this.
Zep, did you want to add something to that?
I fully agree with what Professor Alaedini said. Maybe just a small note that I think it's interesting that the government is pursuing a privatization of its state-owned industries at the same time as profits in manufacturing and non-oil commodity production have been rising at times over the past 10 years. And so I projected, those privatization efforts have also led to a lot of company restructuring. So I think that also needs to be taken into account. This is as far as I've looked at the data, at least.
But doesn't, in general, however, doesn't company restructuring and privatizations lead to job losses? That's been the international experience.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. That's my point.
Ah. Okay.
Yeah. So I think there's been there's been opportunities for profits in some of these sectors, but at the same time, there's been a lot of company restructuring of some of the larger firms in these sectors. So yeah, so I'm not 100% sure what the outcomes have been of this.
Yeah.
We have gone over time, but I do want to take advantage of having Val on this panel to ask a question about this natural experiment. When you look at certainly our region, you see that the most patriarchal societies are the ones that have most oil revenues. So you might think that oil empowers autocrats, it empowers patriarchs at the state level, at the household level. So does it make sense to ask the question whether sanctions have empowered women in some way? Because this oil money that usually comes first to men, both in terms of the bureaucracy and in terms of subsidies. Now, it's clear from what you have said and from what I've seen that women have suffered. But in terms of relative losses, if men have lost more, is it possible that at the household level, we might observe women asserting themselves because they're now taking care of the education of the kids because of COVID, they're managing resources with less income, and the guy isn't bringing as much money as before. Is there literature on that? What do you think?
I haven't seen any literature on it yet, but I think that we can. It's an interesting speculation as to whether sanctions might actually work in a way counter to the historical record. What do we know about sanctions? In Iraq, it was pretty dire, the outcomes for households and families and women, very dire. And in fact, the patriarchal tendencies intensified and were reinforced. Now, Cuba has been Cuba was a different case entirely because, of course, the US sanctions have been in place for, since like 1961. But for decades, Cuba was supported and protected by the USSR and the socialist bloc until 1990, and then it entered, its sort of special period. That special period is actually when things started unraveling for women in Cuba. And there have been certain outcomes that people have talked about, in fact, growth of some prostitution and that sort of thing, which simply didn't exist before. But that was a different case precisely because of the fact that Cuba was protected by the socialist camp. Now, in Iran, we've seen no evidence at all that women have seen any benefits whatsoever from the sanctions. None. Their labor force participation has declined. They don't seem to be mobilizing as a particular identity group for more benefits from the regime. So I can't see that. And if it did happen, it would be historically unprecedented.
I agree with you. I think it would be historically unprecedented, but we really don't quite know. With that, I'd like to turn the control to Mehran. I want to thank everyone, all the panelists and the audience who persisted. I thought this was a fascinating panel. I learned quite a bit, even though I'm not a specialist in this area. And Mehran.
Thank you very much for moderating this panel, and thanks a lot to our panelists. It was a fantastic panel, very informative, and I hope our audience enjoyed it as well. Thanks a lot. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Great
Thank
to
you.
have you,
And a recording of this will be available on the Bourse and Bazaar site soon.
YouTube channel. We will share it with those who are registered for the event. Yes.
Great.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye,
شبتون
everyone.
بخیر. خیلی خوش ممنونم.